So kia ora, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining this open Zoom on our draft advice on the second emissions reduction plan. Today we're going to focus on the task for the second emissions budget and the chapter on research, science, innovation and technology. Before we get any further though, I'm going to invite my colleague Bevan to open us with a karakia.
O ngā mihi nui ki a tātou I runga I te pāka whakāta reo nei, a nei he karakia tīmatanga. Paua ki runga, paua ki raro, ruia, tuia, kōkiritia, kia mau, kia u, kia ora ai. He pikinga ki te rangi, kia tui tāiao, he pau e hora, he pau a rangi, kia hora a papa. Haume e hui e, tai ki e. So my colleagues have asked me just to translate that for you. I'll give you a short translation. So it speaks to our organisation name, He Pauarangi, which is the sacred bond between Rangi Nui and Papa Tuanuku, the sky and the earth. The karakia speaks of restoring balance from human transgressions. As humans, it's our duty to restore that balance. It's a reminder that our environment is our superior, our tuakana, tuahine. And it's our duty to whakautu, to restore that balance and restore mana. So yeah, paua is a metaphoric post, gathering of people to support a cause, which is what we're doing. Ruia is to plant what is needed, take what is needed, leave what which is not needed. Tuia is to walk arm in arm. Kōkiritia, to champion a cause, and hora, to make public or display. So kia ora tātou, tēnā koutou.
Kia ora, Bevan. So in this session, you'll hear from my colleagues around the draft advice we've just released for public consultation. Today, we're going to focus on the introductory chapters, which set out the frameworks that we've used to provide this advice. Chapter 2, which sets out the task for the second emissions reduction plan, and Chapter 13, which looks at science, research, innovation and technology. If we move the slides on one, please. By way of introduction, so we've just provided this advice, and we're going to be providing an opportunity for public consultation on that advice over the next few weeks. But today we're going to give an overview of those chapters, but leave plenty of time for your questions. Next slide, please. So by way of background about our role as the Commission, so the Commission was created in 2019 with the passing of the Zero Carbon Bill. Under the Act, we have very specific functions, and the Act details a number of the considerations we have to have as we provide our advice. Those include giving effect to the Crown-Maori relationship, Te Ao Māori, the specific impacts on iwi and Māori in the advice that we give to government. We need to consider the distribution of effects, including across generations. We need to think about the economic effects and also the social, cultural and environmental circumstances that we're giving our advice into. As a Commission, we're an independent Crown entity with an advisory role as part of the broader system of climate policy and government policy within Aotearoa. The advice and recommendations that we give as a Commission are guided by our board, and we provide that to government for them to consider. Our conclusions and recommendations are founded on the science, evidence and analysis, which is carried out by us as the staff, and importantly is based on input from stakeholders. So next slide, please, Felicia. So today we're going to be talking about our advice for the second emissions reduction plan. We have a number of other pieces of advice coming up over the next 18 months or so. Firstly, in next year, the Commission will start to provide annual reports on assessing the progress towards meeting emissions budgets and national adaptation plans. In 2024, we'll also report on a review of the 2050 emissions reduction target. setting advice for the fourth emissions budget, and review whether to include emissions from international aviation shipping in the 2050 target. At the moment, a call for evidence is on our website, looking for evidence that could help us in our assessment of those pieces of work. And there's more information available on our website if you have evidence that you'd like to submit to that. Last week, we launched our consultation on our draft advice to government on the direction of policy for the second emissions reduction plan. Consultation is a chance for us to share our thinking and also for people to submit on what they've seen in our advice. Once we've incorporated and reflected on the advice on the submissions that we receive, we will present our final advice to the government by the end of the year. Next slide, please. So the second emissions budget has for the period of 2026 to 2030 has already been set, and now the government needs to set out its plan for delivering on it. Because the government already has its first emissions reduction plan in place, this draft advice is focused on building on the work that's already progressing in the first emissions budget period. So our work includes identifying where there are critical gaps which might exist and where existing actions might need to be strengthened or accelerated to achieve the second emissions budget and the country's long-term climate goals. Reflecting the fact that there is already much action underway, the Commission's draft advice has fewer recommendations than the last time we provided this advice in 2021. Importantly, this draft advice builds on the evidence base we created through our previous rounds of analysis. We have also gathered and analysed data and evidence from a wide range of credible sources and reviewed a broad range of literature to support the development of this draft advice. We've used both quantitative and qualitative tools to guide our analysis, and we've tested the quality of our evidence, refining it along the way. Next slide, please. So turning to consultation. So we're consulting on our draft advice at the moment. It's then the role of the government of the day to decide on the specific policy choices to give effect to the emissions reduction plan. We understand that people are at the heart of their policy. It's important our advice reflects what people in Aotearoa New Zealand are experiencing and care about. Having input is vitally important to us. We want to know if you think our recommendations reflect the correct path that New Zealand should be taking to reduce emissions and to meet the legislated targets. We look forward to receiving your submissions. At the end, I'll cover how to make a submission. There's more information about this on our website. Next slide, please. So very briefly, I'll give an overview of the introduction chapter. So next slide, please, Felicia. So this slide sets out the targets that are set in legislation. So when the Climate Change Response Act was passed in 2019, it put into law new 2050 emissions reduction targets. There are three components to the 2050 target. The first is to achieve net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases other than biogenic methane by 2050 and to stay at net zero beyond. So that includes carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. Then there's two targets for reducing biogenic methane. Firstly, to reduce biogenic methane by 10% below 2017 levels by 2030, and then a range for 2050 of reducing by between 24 and 47% by 2050. The Act also established a system of emissions budgets which act as stepping stones towards meeting our long-term targets and made a requirement to develop and implement climate change policies to meet those budgets. The first three budgets have been set, and now we're looking at how what policies are needed to achieve the second budget period. Next slide, please. So in giving our advice on the second emissions reduction plan, we've used two tools to formulate our frameworks. So the first has helped us to prioritise which elements of our advice become proposed recommendations. By way of context, there are around 400 government actions underway as part of the first emissions reduction plan, and a variety of other emissions reducing actions are also being taken by others around Aotearoa. We've prioritised actions for the second emissions budget against six aspects which are each critical to consider. The first is the potential for the opportunity or policy or enabler, how much it can help us meet the second emissions budget, taking into account the scale, the evidence available, technology feasibility, economic and cost considerations. The second is identifying if there are any gaps in policy at the moment. The third is around the pace and timing of action. Particularly, will the pace be sufficient to contribute to the second emissions budget, or will it lay the foundations to achieving the future budgets and targets? We've also considered what risks there might be to realising the potential and other risks associated with the action. We've considered equity, including intergenerational equity, the distribution of effects on sectors, regions and social groups, and issues relevant to the Crown Maori relationship, KR Maori, and the specific impacts on iwi and Maori. And we've also considered co-benefits that might come along with particular actions. For example, health or well-being impacts, or furthering economic development, or other environmental or ecological factors. Those aspects are distilled from the matters that we're required to consider under the Act. As part of this consultation, we're seeking your feedback on that framework and how we've used it to prioritise actions. The second tool that we've used is the policy framework, which is pictured on the right of the screen, which has helped us assess the direction of policy needed to support the priority actions. We've looked at how emissions pricing is likely to drive change, identified where barriers currently exist to deter low emissions choices, and where strategic investment can help drive deeper change over the long term. We've also considered critical gaps in the current policy landscape, the potential for co-benefits as well as well-being impacts. Next slide, please. So this is the structure of our draft advice. In essence, we're saying that action is needed now. We need to build on the momentum that's been developed so far, but also to broaden, strengthen, and accelerate action to meet our climate goals. We've structured our advice into three parts: fundamentals for success, creating low emissions options, and enabling system transformation. Each chapter identifies the opportunities and challenges facing Aotearoa New Zealand as it transitions to a low emissions future. In part one, we focus on getting the fundamentals elements of success right, as they lay the foundation for effective action across all emission budget periods. In part two, we focus on specific sectors, the actions which will contribute to their role in reducing emissions, and the Commission's proposed recommendations. And in part three, we shift towards action needed across key enablers that will support a low emissions system transformation. As I mentioned at the start, today we'll cover the task for the second emissions budget, and also research, science, innovation and technology. So with all that said, so what we want to do today is have lots of opportunities for you to ask us questions. So if there are questions you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask your questions. If possible, please also include your name and any affiliation in that question. Just helps us to understand where the questions are coming from. We're going to do our best to answer all the questions today, but if we don't get an opportunity, there's always the opportunity to email us at hello@climatecommission.gov.nz, where we can follow up with any questions that we don't get to. So final reminder that this session is being recorded and will be available on our website after the event. With that all said, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Paul, who will talk more about the task for the second budget period.
Kia ora koutou, ko Paul Young toko ingoa. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining us for this talk. So I'm here to talk about Chapter 2, the task for the second emissions budget. And the purpose of this chapter was to lay out some key context for the second emissions reduction plan and our advice on that. The chapter gives an overview of what's needed to meet the second and third emissions budgets and how the package of policies in the government's first emissions reduction plan could contribute towards meeting those budgets. So in it, we briefly recap and give a bit of an overview of our previous advice in an Aotearoa New on a pathway to meet the emissions budgets. And then we look at the government assessment from its first ERP and provide commentary on what this tells us about the task for the next plan. Next slide, please, Felicia. Thank you. So a couple of key messages on this up front are that meeting the emissions budget requires concerted and timely action across all sectors. And we make the point that, by pursuing a range of opportunities that will give Aotearoa New Zealand the best chance to deliver on the emissions budgets and the 2050 target. And we really need to see action accelerated across the board as we move into the second emissions budget period. So as Chris talked about in the intro, the emissions budgets are set as stepping stones towards the 2050 target. And these are expressed as an all gas quantity, even though the targets have those different components. And this chart here shows the trajectory for net emissions under what we call the demonstration path, which meets those three emissions budgets and also sets up to meet the 2050 target. So going back to Untitled Chapter, which we delivered in 2021, we produced our recommended emissions budgets through developing a series of scenarios that explored in detail how we can meet and sustain the 2050 target. And we tested uncertainty around the pace and nature of technology and behaviour changes that could be achieved over the coming decades. As we're required to by the Act, we also assessed a wide range of matters regarding the transition, including how to contribute to the global efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And through this process, we sort of honed in and refined what we call the demonstration path, which demonstrates a realistic pathway to meet the emissions budgets. So that contains a package of actions that would set the country up. And you can see more about those actions in a table that we have in the chapter. That's a bit too much information to include in these slides. But that sort of can be used to benchmark the level of effort and progress across different areas of the economy. So the government took the demonstration path that the Commission had put forward and used that to set sector sub-targets in the first emissions reduction plan. And these effectively break down the total emissions in those budgets into amounts for each sector. And that's not a hard target, but to guide action and track progress. So next slide, please. So what we're seeing here is the emissions reductions expected to meet those sector sub-targets, looking over the first three emissions budgets. So you've got, in this chart, you can see the sectors labelled along the top, and the three bars for each one are emissions budgets 1, 2, and 3. And what we're seeing is the gap between the projected baseline emissions prior to the first emissions reduction plan policies having any effect, and then the sector sub-targets. So compared to, I guess, business as usual at the time, how much did each sector need to bend the curve down and close that gap to meet those sector sub-targets? And so the chart shows how emissions reductions need to ramp up over time across every sector as actions take effect and scale up. And mostly this shows a fairly smooth ramping up. So the emissions reductions just building over time, but there are a couple of notable exceptions to speak to. The first one is when we're looking at emissions budget 2, and if you could click the slide, Felicia, thanks. So looking at emissions budget 2, we notice a big step up in the energy and industry sector, and also that it delivers, or it's expected to deliver the largest share of emissions reductions to meeting the second budget. And that reflects there's a particularly large early opportunity to reduce emissions from electricity generation. And also there's, in process heat, low and medium temperature process heat, significant opportunity for early emissions reductions. Looking ahead to the third emissions budget, we see how emissions reductions from transport really jump and come to be the largest source in that budget period. Now, the reason for that is mostly due to the nature of electric vehicle uptake. So and that relies on rapid scaling up of electric vehicle sales in the 2020s, so that by the third budget period, we're really, replacing all the ICE vehicles as they exit the fleet with EVs, and that leads to a bit of a non-linear tick up in the emissions reductions that we'll see. And that just highlights how actions in the second budget are key for achieving the third emissions budget. So this next slide is there's a little box in the chapter that talks to this, and we've seen, so emissions reductions take time to build, and this is an illustrative example highlighting the importance of prompt action and the peril of delay, I guess. It always takes time to implement and scale up actions, and in many cases further time for these to actually have a meaningful impact on reducing emissions. And some examples of this, generally speaking, the pace that low carbon technologies can replace high emissions technologies often has practical limits around how fast, the rate that assets are retired, and other aspects such as workforce availability and capability. Low carbon infrastructure takes time to consent and build. And another example, in forestry, a newly planted forest absorbs relatively little CO2 in its early years, and then picks up over time with the growth of the forest. So all these time lags and practical limits on the pace of change highlight why early action matters a lot. And what we show here is this generic example where in green we've got annual emissions reductions scaling up over time from some hypothetical action. And then in orange, we've got the same thing, but delayed 2 years. And when we look at adding up the emissions reductions over the budget periods, as you can see in the table there, that shows that the 2-year delay, which might sound reasonably small, would more than halve the total emissions reductions delivered out to 2030. And it also shows how what appears pretty small shortfall in the first budget period sort of becomes a much larger shortfall in the long run as the impacts of that delay accumulate. So this really speaks to some of the inertia that we need to be thinking about, and how the difference between acting now and delaying a few years can be large when we add it up over the emissions budgets periods. And so finally, the government released its first emissions reduction plan last year. And one of the questions for this chapter is, how far does that plan contribute to meeting later emissions budgets? Now, the answer to this, like this chart, is a bit complicated. So I recommend having a read of the chapter for more detailed information than I can provide now. But in the chapter, we've looked at the government policy impact assessment provided in that first emissions reduction plan and provided commentary on this. So all the figures here come from that government assessment rather than our own analysis. Our overall findings in relation to this are that the policies in the first emissions reduction plan, if fully implemented, would make a really meaningful contribution towards meeting the second and third emissions budgets, but further and stronger policies will likely be needed. And that's not really a surprise, given that the plan's focus is primarily on meeting that first emissions budget. Now, while the government's policy impact assessment also suggests that the policies in the first ERP could achieve the second and third emissions budgets, so that's what you're seeing there in that high policy impact case shown in sort of dark orange. Our analysis highlights significant risks around some of the assumptions underlying that, and sort of questions around the plausibility of those high impact estimates. So the main things to speak to here are that in agriculture, that potential sort of overachievement we're seeing there relies on new technologies being proven for market and then adopted quite fast. in order to achieve that really dramatic emissions reductions. Now, that's not something that we assumed would happen when we were recommending the emissions budgets. So those are based on what could be achieved without such new technology. While there's still a lot of uncertainty there, we would note that we flagged quite clearly in an Aotearoa that a significant change like that would be grounds for looking at revising those budgets if that was to come about. Now, the other big area of overachievement that you can see in this chart is in energy and industry. And our assessment is that the government sort of overestimated how fast decarbonisation could happen there. The level of emissions reductions seen in that high impact case would be equivalent to having decarbonised pretty much all low and medium temperature process heat by around the start of the second budget period. And so we don't believe that's sort of feasible considering that the constraints on delivering that. And this is discussed a bit more in our energy and industry chapter. So there are some other risks generally applying here around the reliance on a rising emissions price to drive emissions reductions in energy in particular. That's something that we talk to more in the emissions pricing chapter about the risks to that happening at the moment. And on the other hand, there are some things that this chart that aren't included in the numbers in these charts. So, for example, agricultural emissions pricing was not quantified in that government assessment. And another example is that electric vehicle uptake is progressing well ahead of what government modelling and our own demonstration path thought might occur. So overall, it's a reasonably complicated picture. There are quite a lot of uncertainties, but our view is that there's a significant gap that likely remains to meeting the second emissions budget and the third. And finally, this is also reinforced by the latest government emissions projections that were published in December and are also discussed in the chapter. And so overall, there's looking across those pieces of evidence, we sort of see a gap of around 13 to 20 megatons to close to meet the second emissions budget. And that is the context, I guess, that the rest of the report is grounded in. So I'll hand over now to Felicia to speak to the Research, Science, Innovation and Technology chapter.
Thanks, Paul. Kia ora. I'm Felicia Collincherry. My focus for this advice was the Research, Science, Innovation and Technology chapter. It's included in the third part of the draft advice report, which focuses on enabling system transformation. So while the application of our policy and prioritization frameworks that Chris talked about haven't identified any proposed recommendations in this area, we have identified where action is still needed. In this chapter, we focused on the important activities and pieces of work required to continue driving research and innovation to help meet the second emission budget and longer-term climate targets. These actions center on increasing access to and uptake of new knowledge and technologies, including those within and informed by Mātauranga Maori. We've identified that a strong research, science, innovation, and technology system is fundamental to transform Aotearoa New Zealand to a thriving low emissions future. While the government has a big role to play in ensuring that this happens, the private sector also will need to pull its weight. We know that targeted investment in climate change research and development and a clear set of priorities is also needed. There's a lot of effort at the moment around developing a clear direction for climate change research, and this includes Te Ara Pairangi Future Pathways program, as well as the development of the environment and climate research strategy. These efforts will need to be followed by directed investment to ensure they can be delivered upon. Timing is also important because research and innovation do not happen overnight. Along those same lines, continuity of people and infrastructure, technology, and information will ensure that we have the right resources at the right time. We know that there is a potential for funding gaps with the conclusion of investments through the National Science Challenges. And we know that there is work to address that through the programs underway. But it will be critical that things like Future Pathways retains capacity developed over the last decade. We've also identified that openly available climate change data and information really is essential for the transition. In order to enable the wide use of climate change information, at a minimum, it has to be available for people to access it and apply it in different areas. The current level of open climate change information limits its use, and that will continue to be a barrier if it's not addressed. To drive innovation, our regulatory environment needs to both enable and incentivize early adoption, and regulation reform and investment need to be aligned in order to avoid stalling the progression of new technologies. And we heard this across many different sectors. Finally, we also identify that developing a strong digital economy will be necessary for supporting digitalization across sectors and to improve resiliency across the economy. So I'll stop here. I think we're about halfway through the time we have, and I'll pass over to Chris to close the presentation and open our Q&A session.
Cool. Thanks, Felicia. So we've started our consultation on this. So it started last week and won't run to the 20th of June. We will be giving our final advice to government at the end of December, at which time then they decide they need to respond to our advice and set the direction of policy in the second ERP by the end of 2024. Next slide, please, Felicia. So the consultation is live on our website. We encourage you to read our advice and to make a submission. There's also an opportunity to kind of stay in contact with us through Twitter and LinkedIn and through the other webinars that we're holding over the next couple of weeks. So now is an opportunity for questions. If there's anything you'd like to talk about, ask us about the chapters that we've covered today, please use the Q&A function to type your question, and we'll get to answering them. We've obviously been too efficient in covering all the material in the basis, or it's too early on a Monday morning for the audience. I'd like to think it's our competence there. I might take the opportunity though, Paul, just to ask you a question. So I know that between this advice and the previous advice, there's been a number of changes to things like the refinery and the smelter. How did that affect kind of our assessment of the kind of the path to 2050 and what the gap is for budget 2?
Yes, so just to unpack that a bit. So we've you know, in 2021 in the Aotearoa we had assumed in our sort of baseline scenario and also a demonstration path that we hadn't assumed that the refinery would be closing. We had assumed, based on information from sort of the company and the market at the time, that the aluminium smelter was scheduled to close in 2024. Now, both of those things have panned out differently. Well, the smelter uncertainty still remains, but based on the fact that the owners are, you know, currently in negotiations for a new electricity supply contract to continue, we've sort of, you know, changed our assumption there and now planning on the assumption that it stays open. So I guess one thing to say is that we last year, and we did this for our emissions trading scheme advice last year, we updated the demonstration path to incorporate new information, also the new greenhouse gas inventory. and some of those sort of key assumption changes. And we have republished the data set and a methodology note on that alongside this advice. So if you're interested in that kind of detail, you can find it on the consultation website page. In terms of how it affects the emissions reductions that we would need, on balance, those two changes actually largely sort of would cancel out over budget, at least over budget 2. And we do highlight in the chapter that the latest government emissions projections are still sort of assuming that the aluminium smelter would close. And in addition to the refinery having closed, that would mean a significantly lower emissions and a smaller gap to meeting the next budget. So as I've said, we don't think that's a good basis to plan on anymore. We think that there's a high chance that the smelter will stay, and the government should be planning on that basis to make sure that its plans are adequate to meet emissions budgets 2 and 3.
Cool. The first, we have a question from Jane Palmer, which I think you, Paul, would be well placed to answer. So it's about how has your monitoring role in the implementation of the first ERP informed the development of this second piece of advice? And I think there's a kind of issue there that the timing is a bit tricky. Could you talk us through that part?
Yeah, that's right. So we have not delivered an annual monitoring report yet, which we're required to do under the Act next year for the first time. So that is from next year, every year, the Commission will deliver an annual progress report on progress towards meeting the emissions budgets. Because of just the condensed timing of the first emissions budget and what the Act lays out, we haven't done one of those yet before we're required to deliver the second emissions reduction plan advice. So the situation we were in is to just have to, I guess, looking at the information in that second emissions reduction plan, a bit of a look at some of the key trends that we're seeing, but that full monitoring picture will be released next year, and we'll be working on that throughout this year.
Cool. Thank you. Another one for you, Paul. I think picking up what we were just talking about in terms of aluminium smelter. So a question from Matthew Gardner about why extend the smelter operation all the way out to 2050? What's the thinking behind that?
I guess, in the absence of any better information about, a potential closure date, our default is to assume no change. So, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty around this in terms of, we're really focused, on the nearer term picture is more important, I guess. We don't know a lot of things about how things will pan out in the future, but we can adjust as we go. The other thing, I guess, is that, it would make potentially make relatively little difference further out as the electricity grid is decarbonised. The impact of that closure wouldn't be as large as it would be now.
Thank you. Felicia, I think a question for you. Is there a particular reason that the actions required in the enabling system transformation, particularly research, science, innovation and technology, haven't led to a formal recommendations? Is it because the recommendations don't fit with the sector by sector approach to emissions reduction planning?
So it's less that and more that there are a number of efforts underway that we didn't identify significant evidence that would suggest that there is a policy gap. That was one of the main elements that we looked at with this. Of course, we looked at all of the 6. So at the moment, it's really difficult to identify how much is spent on climate change research in particular. We want to highlight the fact that we do need more work in this area, but there isn't clear evidence that we can support a recommendation on. However, actions are still needed. I think in the question that there are no recommendations in the enabling systems transformation section of the report. And it's kind of a similar situation in which there's a lot happening already through the government's first emission reduction plan. And until we see some of those things come to fruition and how they are implemented, we won't know whether or not there's actually a gap. There's just not enough information available yet about those.
Cool. The next question is from Jane Palmer. Have you used the same underlying models as in your first piece of advice? Let's take that one, Paul.
Yeah, kia ora, Jane. Essentially, yes. There actually isn't a lot of modelling involved in this advice. We largely, the emissions budgets have been set, and the pathway that we'd developed to meet those budgets is, as I've talked about, we're largely just sort of building on what we've done before in an Aotearoa. We haven't done new scenarios or anything like that. There are one piece of modelling that was done for the energy sector, looking at the impact of a delayed generation build on emissions from the electricity sector, and that was done using by Energy Link, who have a proprietary model. Now that you can find more information about that also on the consultation webpage. But yeah, that's the extent of the new modelling that was done for this work.
Thank you. So a question which I think might be something that we could get into in some of the other webinars. So Paul Bruce asks, does the Commission take into account the biophysical limits of mineral availability to provide electrical infrastructure for renewable generations and replace fossil fuels? Sorry, the questions just moved in my chat. Will the Commission give advice on reducing energy use necessary to enable a transition away from fossil fuels to meet the targets?
Is this for me?
I think it might be for you, Paul.
Okay, well, kia ora, Paul. Yeah, I think that's an important question. Yes, we do take into account that sort of thing. We're aware of quite a lot of research globally that's looking at mineral availability. Generally we don't see an issue there in the in terms of the pathway that we're recommending. There are a number of pieces of research that I've seen that point to sufficient availability for minerals. There is obviously a big expansion of production required over time, but that we've seen that in other areas. In terms of, I guess, reduction in energy use, I mean, one thing about the transition is that it does, through electrification, we do see big reductions in primary energy use. So electric vehicles are much more efficient in terms of the energy inputs to provide the mobility. And so overall, the transition does lead to a reduction in primary energy use. So I guess that is part of our pathway development. The question is, so the scenarios that we've developed, we think lay out what is necessary to transition away from fossil fuels and meet the targets.
Sure, cool. At the moment, we don't have any more questions. So a last, but we do have some more time. So if there's any more questions that you'd like to ask Paul or Felicia or me about the introduction, please pop them in the Q&A at the bottom, and we'll do our best to answer them. I'll give you a few seconds to, I'm assuming, in case people are typing long questions, I'll give you a few seconds to type them in there. Okay. Well, I think if there's no more questions, I'd just like to thank everybody for coming along. I'd like to thank Paul and Felicia for presenting today. Thank you very much for coming along, everybody, and listening to us as we present our work. We encourage everybody to read the advice that we've given and to make a submission via our website. And I'd like to invite Bevan to close us with a karakia.
Tēnā koutou mua koutou whai wāhi I tēnei rā, anei te karakia whakamutunga. Kia hiki te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūruki ai te ao marama. Haumi e hui e, tai.